think it's particularly appropriate that our very first lecture tonight, we'll let everybody come on in, is by James Morris, who is our new hire in the theology department. He is a professor of Islamic studies at Boston College. He was an undergraduate at the University of Chicago. And then Jim and I were graduate students together at Harvard. We graduated in the very same year, and we took Persian class together. And Jonathan as well, my husband, who's the fellow co-chair of, so it's like old home week coming back. And I can tell you that Jim was very good in Persian class. In fact, he used to come to class with a bunch of people from Arabic. And those of us who had not quite risen to his level of Arabic were patiently sitting there because we got out earlier. And we call them the Arabs. The Arabs are coming because they pronounced Persian in a rather strange way. But they knew the grammar very well. After Chicago, Jim went on and had extensive teaching stints at Oberlin and the University of Exeter in England, as well as Princeton, the Sorbonne, and the Institute of Ismaili Studies in both London and Paris, before he began this year at BC. So we're very lucky to have it. He has an extensive bibliography. He's brought a couple of books over there on the table. He sent me his complete CV, and I'm not going to read it. It ran to 20 pages. My computer ran out of paper by the time I was printing it out. But his research and studies have taken him to many areas of the Islamic world, from Morocco, Iran, Afghanistan, Turkey, Egypt, and Southeast Asia, where he studied the living spiritual tradition of Islam. He's published widely on many areas of religious thought and practice, including the Islamic Humanities, Islamic philosophy, Sufism, the Quran, and Shiite thought. He has major publications on Mullah Sadra, who was a 17th century Persian Sufi, the foremost representative of the Ilahi or Illuminist school, Ibn Arabi, the great Andalusian philosopher of the 12th century, and several forthcoming works as well on the Quran and other subjects. And today, I'm very happy to welcome him. He's going to speak on God is Beautiful and He Loves Beauty, Remembrance and Repetition in Islamic Arts. Please join me in welcoming to our faculty, James Morris.
There are a lot more places over here. Take your time.
Now, you should come in. It's a long lecture, and you don't want to stand
up.
So move to the middle row. There's one down here. There are a couple more over here.
Quite a few places over here.
And
just come on. I have some things to say.
Walk across the front of the stage, and you can announce yourself.
Wait, well, but folks sitting in the edge over here. You want to get around here?
There are real chairs. There are lots of chairs down there.
Okay. First of all, the title that is announced and is on the booklet and everything was what I gave to Sheila in March when I found out. As soon as I found out I was coming here, she immediately said, "You've got to get this lecture." I hadn't seen the objects, and so I gave her something that was on the notion of dhikr, remembrance, and repetition. But actually, I've changed it slightly and a little broadened it to give you a broad background to the wider cultural and civilizational background of the exhibit here. Remembrance. So God is beautiful and He loves beauty, that's the same, but remembrance and realization in the Islamic humanities, so some pretty key changes there that widen the scope of the lecture. I've also put up a couple of unfamiliar Arabic words or Islamic words that find their way in most of the languages of that tradition, which I'll actually be talking about in the lecture, but I can point to them so you can see how they're spelled or whatever. I suspect that I see colleagues here who do Hindu and other traditions, that one of the things you end up having to do is explain a lot. There's like foundational words. I sometimes think you could do all of Islamic civilization and culture in about 25 words, you know? And similar probably with Buddhism. That's the midterm, yeah. So anyway, this is when they were doing the introduction or the opening ceremonies of the 8th, and a wonderful commemoration of the Calderwoods, who in many ways are behind all of what we're witnessing here. Somebody mentioned that they were told in lecture class to only give 3 main ideas. That's what students can handle. Well, I assume you're most adults, so we're going to multiply that by a couple of factors. Yeah, you know, I don't know whether it's 2, 4, 8 or something. But anyway, a lot more than 3. So with that in mind, I've got to get going, but I will also let's get going. Good evening. Before I begin my actual lecture tonight, I'd like to stress two basic preliminary points. And in fact, it would actually help me because I was about to say how much this relates to the exhibit. How many of you have not yet had a chance to see the exhibit? If you could just, that's, wow, okay. I kind of wrote this for people who had had a little chance to see it, but I hope since I leave you an open that after you've at least read this, that you go over and just walk through, because it's really condensed. It's not like going to the Met or the British Museum or something. You can really get a lot, just 15 minutes, 20 minutes of your first glance walking through there. So what I'm saying here does relate quite a bit to the exhibit. First of all, if you've taken the time to view even a little of the extraordinary exhibition, then you already know intuitively much of what I'll be speaking about. But the essential purpose of all the unfamiliar religious symbolism and metaphysical conceptions that I'll be introducing and explaining here is simply to draw our attention to realities that we already do know intimately. Realities ordinarily embedded so unconsciously within ourselves and our experience that we may need to be reminded of them occasionally, if only to recalibrate our individual spiritual compasses. In the language of the tradition and civilization we'll be exploring together tonight, that all-encompassing reality is called Deen, or if you will, the one divine and universal religion and reality, with a capital R, being the first word up there, and our innate but inchoate human awareness of those realities is called Fitra, our primordial knowing of that spirit or creative breath of life, which is everything we ultimately and truly are. Second word up there. The second preliminary point is even simpler. While this lecture is essentially devoted to elaborating those aspects of Quranic teaching which are most essential to our understanding of the Islamic arts and humanities, I must ask you to do your best to simply set aside for this hour all the cultural stereotypes and the images most of us inevitably associate with Islam and things Islamic these days, at least till the very end of this discussion, when we'll come back, hopefully, with a deeper understanding of some of the underlying reasons for the immense gulf that so visibly separates the foundational Quranic teaching and its fruits in traditional Islamic civilization from the all-too-familiar dualistic political ideologies mirrored in today's media images. So this talk is divided into three parts. I begin with a sort of archaeology of the spirit, which consists in drawing out what we all actually know, if only implicitly, simply from contemplating the unforgettable beauty of this remarkable range of historic objects, especially as we're helped along by Sheila and Jonathan's constantly illuminating introductory descriptions. If you go to the exhibit, read what it says. They spent a lot of time on that. Okay. In other words, what deeper human and historical realities can we uncover simply by reflecting a bit on the original wider context of these surviving treasures? This exercise of our imagination is something that historians and archaeologists do every day, and the points I'll be making in this first part are all things that you can personally confirm and experience more fully, simply by traveling, whether physically or through books and images and films, to any of the great centers of earlier Islamic civilization, from West Africa to Indonesia and China. And if you do travel in person, you may have the even greater good fortune, especially in the remote corners where something of the traditional Islamic word still survives, of encountering memorable human representatives of that endangered civilization, which is our primary focus tonight. Next, part two briefly introduces some of the wider religious and civilizational contexts and meanings shared by all the Islamic humanities, both in their artistic dimensions and especially in their wider ethical and spiritual presuppositions and implications. Here, in part two, we focus on the centrality of contemplation, or of dhikr, a little bit further down on the list there, remembrance of God, in the Quran and the Islamic humanities more generally, briefly outlining that theology of right and beautiful action, or ihsan, the real core of my talk tonight, that is the humanly central message of the Quran. Finally, part three returns to a brief reminder of the devastating shock of the sudden loss or destruction of the civilization centered on ihsan, essentially ordered around the contemplation of that divine beauty and its creative, ethical, and artistic expressions, concluding with the unavoidable challenges that loss now poses for all of us. So part one, what this exhibit tells us. Let us begin with the most basic experiences that many of the objects in this exhibit surely evoke for anyone who spends some time contemplating them. Basic aesthetic premises which will normally arise just as automatically for anyone listening to a superb recitation of the Quran, when I was playing different reciters before the ad, or from visiting a so truly sacred site or shrine. These initial reactions flow naturally and spontaneously from that essential shared human spiritual receptivity and aptitude, our very fitra. First, and there'll be some lists here, there is the absolute immediacy and simultaneous sense of transcendence, of an irreducible ineffability whenever we witness the poignant beauty of virtually all these objects. Anyone can and must grasp this reality directly, with no need for any preparation or acculturation, just as we do whenever we encounter the presence of the Spirit in all the incomparable beauties of the natural created world, as suggested in the famous prophetic saying, the hadith that opens the title of his talk, Huwa Jamilun wa Jamal, God is beautiful. God is beautiful and he loves beauty. Next, any prolonged attention to any of these works automatically carries us into a state of deeper and deeper contemplation. The more we let go, the more lost we become, not just in the intricate details, ornament, and workmanship of the physical object, but especially in the spiritual reality and mystery of that divine beauty that those visible qualities quite intentionally evoke. Third, there's also the cumulative effect of the presence of such radiance. As we move from one object here to its even more fascinating neighbor, we may find our awareness of their beauty to be inseparable from a lingering state of inner love and longing. Indeed, a sort of spiritual homesickness or nostalgia, the deepest root of each collector's insatiable passion. I speak from experience here, which arises from the sense of an intriguing reality at once transcendent and ungraspable, a presence that grows in us precisely in proportion to our fascinated attention. Or in other words, an awakening to that essential mystery and primordial desire which the prophet, followed by many later generations of incomparable mystic poets, called the fragrant perfumes of the Spirit. Finally, if we switch from these more spiritual intuitions, the reflections of our intellect, happily aided by Jonathan and Sheila's explanations, and I should add not only in the descriptions but also in the wonderful catalog that they put together, we cannot but be filled with a growing awe at the sheer amount of work, of time, rigorously focused energy, subtle attention, and all-consuming spiritual intention that must have gone into the making of each and every one of these superb creations. Most of them took a year or years, I would suspect, to make, even the tiniest, perhaps especially the tiniest objects you'll see there. All those necessary elements of realized perfection, simultaneously ethical, spiritual, and aesthetic, are brought together in that central human reality of ihsan, that is to say, of knowing and recreating what is truly beautiful and good, which is the primary subject of this lecture. We're still in part 1 now, from objects of beauty to an Islamic civilization. No one who seriously studies and experiences this exhibition is likely to doubt that there really is, or at least was for more than a millennium, something that we can readily call an Islamic civilization. So our next step, like an archaeologist or historian, as our next step, let us reflect on a few of the most important things, the shared qualities of these carefully selected objects tell us about the historical miracle of the global spread of an entire civilization whose birth and ongoing inspiration in virtually every domain, reaching far beyond the limited sphere of these visceral arts, apparently goes back to the singular qualities, at once musical, poetic, rhetorical, and more deeply transformational, of the Quran alone. Begin with the earliest objects in this exhibit, including some of the earliest surviving pages of a written Quran, remind us of the remarkable rapidity and comprehensiveness of the formative historical development of the Islamic arts. You can see this most clearly in the Dome of the Rock. This phenomenon, clearly today, because it's really survived, this phenomenon includes both the rapid early development of their distinctive unifying themes and features, and concomitantly the ongoing process of the creative assimilation of originally quite distinct local or regional cultural tastes, patterns, and methods, a process that is strikingly illustrated throughout this exhibit. Second, equally evident in this exhibition is the extraordinary geographical and cultural reach and diversity of that Islamic civilization. So telling the evidence here in objects drawn literally from Spain to China. Perhaps most importantly of all, this exhibit highlights the ways the aesthetic principles and common themes of this civilization stretched across an immense range of practical uses, functions, and social locations. From royal patronage of certain Quranic manuscripts and other accoutrements you find here of major monuments and shrines, to mundane items drawn from every realm of daily life, from cradles to tombstones. Understandably, the objects available here in this exhibit largely reflect modern Western collectors' notions of fine art. Could I ask you to find a place for the people who are standing there, if you point one out? So quite a few seats here. Help you out. Don't want to have you long enough. You don't want to be sitting up the whole time. So Understandably, the objects available here in this exhibit largely reflect modern Western collectors' notions of fine art as coming primarily from urban, noble, and wealthy urban bourgeois settings. Yet in reality, the very same shared visual themes and their aesthetic presuppositions could just as easily be illustrated from an infinitely wider range of rural and tribal settings to be found everywhere in the pre-modern Islamic world. Next, if we read the labels here, or if we already know something of their shifting historical context, we are likewise constantly reminded of the complex ongoing role of intercivilizational exchange, cosmopolitan trade, and economic connections, involving both export markets beyond the Islamic world and the importing and creative imitation of Oriental and later European luxury goods. That same process of cultural exchange and creative interconnection has always applied, at least equally, to all other areas of Islamic civilization, especially the realms of philosophy, the sciences, technology, medicine, literature, music, and major forms of devotional life, such as the local rituals of sainthood, pilgrimage, festivals, and so on. I happen to have one in my pocket just to illustrate this, something that came from the Buddhist world into Islam and then on into rosaries, which should be familiar to many people at BC. Finally, we cannot help but be struck by the abrupt and problematic ending of this exhibit's chosen artifacts in the mid-19th century with Qajar Iran and the late Ottoman Empire. For the purposes of this talk, at least, we can assume that that sudden stopping point reflects not just the vagaries of one collector's taste, but deeper and more fundamental historical realities to which we shall return in part 3 at the end of this lecture. Moving on now to the human realities shaping this civilization. Finally, bringing together our own aesthetic experience of these beauties and our brief historical reflections in their civilizational context, we can begin to ask ourselves, what are the human realities, the underlying human realities behind each of these extraordinary features? The actual individual human activities, tastes, and presuppositions that together brought into being a millennial civilization whose larger unities and spiritual foundations are at least equally apparent in all the other Islamic humanities. When we ask that straightforward question, we are immediately reminded of 5 underlying historical phenomena, presuppositions for a civilization, if you will, whose very existence still seems just as mysterious today as ever. First, there is their wider background of shared ideals and tastes. Now, when we stop to think about it, the original life worlds evoked by the handful of representative objects brought together here were in fact the collective actions, or collective result of literally millions of individual lifetimes, stretching for more than a millennium across most of the Eastern Hemisphere, that were single-mindedly devoted to acts of creation of similar reminders of the divine beauty in every sphere of life. Even more fundamentally, those objects, when we actually carry them back into their original living context, remind us above all of an even more widely shared moral, spiritual, and economic set of tastes and assumptions, which set the highest possible value on the expression, realization, and contemplation of such acts of beauty and goodness, ihsan, not just in this or that restricted fine art, but literally in every sphere of life and activity. Second, the magnificent objects collected here are self-evidently the outcome of a clearly defined shared inspiration. In other words, of a shared common symbolic language and syntax, which I will elaborate below in part 2, that again was shared by a host of widely scattered, almost always anonymous individual creators. Just as with the preeminent case of Islamic spiritual poetry, that shared symbolic language was then maintained over many centuries by the widely disseminated tastes and distinctive values of millions of others among their audiences, users, connoisseurs, and lesser imitators. Third, literally everything in this exhibit reminds us of the characteristic sacralization of beauty. Beauty as a central emblem of the realized divine presence in every area of social life, especially in routine everyday functions, not just in the narrow sense of what we in the West think of today as specifically religious rituals and contexts. Fourth, this collection immediately suggests the global trans-civilizational and a fortiori trans-religious appeal of these works of beauty, which were created, purchased, desired, copied, and creatively adapted by individuals from a host of ever-changing cultures, languages, and locally dominant religious traditions. In other words, this Islamic, or as Hashim would say, Islamic civilization and its distinctive aesthetic spiritual norms were, at least till the global transformations of the 19th century, widely shared across nominally different religious groups and in all areas of culture and life, including pervasive cognate religious practices such as pilgrimages, shrines, devotions, and the fundamental sacralizing role of the saints or friends of God, the awliya, who were venerated across Within this exhibit, for example, such physical reminders of this much wider inclusive dimension of classical Islamic civilization include an early Syrian Christian capital, 2 striking articles from nominally Catholic Spain and Italy, several objects from South Asia whose provenance could probably be Buddhist or Hindu as well as Muslim, or the extraordinary Bektashi paper cutout of Ali's name and honorifics in the form of a lion, which is so reminiscent of the use of the same artistic techniques today for Jewish marriage contracts, ketuvim. Finally, everything in this exhibition powerfully illustrates the supreme civilizational value placed in the perfection of beauty and beautiful action on ihsan al-amal, not just in these visual arts, but in all the other Islamic humanities and wider spheres of social action as well. I shall return to this last point again many times in this lecture, but here a single memorable anecdote will have to help convey what it feels like to live within a civilization where, in so many cases, all of an individual's time, energy, and spiritual attention were directed at the single end of an absolute perfection of right action. A few years ago, during a late-night gathering in Majlis in Tehran of their greatest, now elderly masters of traditional Iranian music, the conversation turned to their own childhood musical training and initiation, in contrast with the obvious impossibility of recreating those traditional conditions today. In short, those young apprentices were expected to spend at least 3 or 4 years accompanying and serving their master before they were actually even allowed to take up their chosen instrument. And that initiation period, for example, as one person described, could involve being sent up alone before dawn several miles up into the high desert mountains, so that at sunrise they could contemplate, like David or Moses, all the sounds of wind, birds, waters, light, and the spiritual presences to be discovered at the waterfalls high up in the Alborz. Now, if this sounds like the stuff of kung fu movies and the like, that very real resonance is only a reminder of how recently and similarly the same world historical figures have devastated each of our major civilizational traditions, not just the Islamic one. To fully appreciate this last point, and before turning to our promised theological considerations, I would like to ask each of you to supply here a few of your own memorable childhood or later experiences of that unforgettable total sense of accomplishment at being able to truly perfect a drawing, a school project, a poem, or a musical performance, or an athletic performance. Or of those equally rare and memorable times when you were able to devote yourself totally to each person whom you encountered in the course of the day. Or it may be easier to recall, and I think it is easier to recall the contrary sort of moments, our equally memorable experiences of painful frustration at being suddenly stopped or prevented from fulfilling that perfection of action and intention, which is ihsan. And here I have to stop, because if it were a workshop, I'd actually stop and make sure you know what I'm talking about here. It's psychologically, it's very, very interesting when you ask people to discover this. I mean, I have to say a couple things that popped into my mind. One was like, in school, when you're like filling in drawings when you're a little kid and you're kept from actually finishing it. Time's up, our class is over, go somewhere else. You remember how that drive you crazy? Seriously. Or of another thing, for years and years I slaved for my father chopping weeds out of soybean fields in Illinois, where I was a farm worker from 4 or 5 onward. And about 10 years, I was talking about to reach the age of 10, he finally said, "Jim, you're the laziest chopper I've ever seen." So, "What do you mean lazy? I'm slaving away at 100 degrees, doing all this." He said, "Yeah, but you're trying to get all the weeds out. I just want you to get the stuff that the neighbors can see, It was like, he never explained that, Well, unfortunately, I think if you stop and think about it, what we think of the tremendous gulf between what you'll see in this exhibit and what passes often for arts, music, poetry, and things today really is that kind, defined by that kind of difference, where that's good enough, get it on the, get it up and empty, get up your website, whatever, that's good enough, let's get on with it, time's valuable, and so forth. So you have to provide your own experiences, but this is how you can get into what makes a civilization tick. In this context, it might be helpful to note that the root Quranic meaning of the word Islam is precisely that experienced union of our own act and intention with the divine will, which actually takes place in such peak experiences of contemplative action and performance, the momentary disappearance or surrender of our ego, and the pure spiritual act and presence itself. And most importantly, we cannot help but notice those things that normally prevent us from practicing and realizing our innate human perception of ihsan in each of these cases, whether that be the higher value placed in economic costs of time or work, a maximization of profit or number of publications, on the economies of mass production, and conformity to external schedules and routines, other momentary priorities, and so on and so on. Pretty much everything that defines our present-day civilization. So now we move on to part 2. We're going to come back to this in part 3, but part 2, Remembrance and Realization in the Islamic Humanities. Now I'd like to turn for a moment to making more explicit the wider civilizational and religious context ultimately underlying, which is to say mirroring and reflecting in every other facet of life, these representative works of beauty. One suitable place to start is music, or rather that particular transcendent recitation, the root meaning of the Arabic word Quran, which inspired so many central features of this civilization. But the traditional Islamic arts are perhaps best understood, as their original audiences so often perceive them, as a special kind of visual music. Indeed, the best way to begin to appreciate them more deeply may be to listen to the traditional spiritual music of any Islamic culture. Beginning with such spiritual music helps us to appreciate these visual arts in their own aesthetic terms, as they were experienced by their original creators and patrons, rather than through our modern assumptions and criteria, which understandably still largely reflect the unconscious influences and artistic centrality of painting and sculpture in the West. So listening, in this case, is much more than a metaphor. For centuries, Islamic music, poetry, and visual arts alike have shared a common aesthetic model and inspiration in the inspired sounds, rhythms, and constantly shifting perspectives of the Quran, whose recitation is always a central part of each Muslim's daily life, as well as many other key ritual occasions. So starting with music quickly brings out certain common forms and presuppositions that link Islamic arts from the most diverse cultures, from West Africa to Indonesia. The most obvious of these shared characteristics is the recurrent patterns of repetition and rhythm, the equivalent in music of what is here called ornament in this exhibit. This central aesthetic feature is evident in a multitude of artistic and social forms, in the distinctive patterns of tribal and courtly couplets, in the spectrum of styles of Arabic calligraphy adapted for writing or for monuments in so many Muslim languages, in the ornamental interplay of arabesque and geometric elements and all the diverse visual media so beautifully illustrated here, in the architectural layout of fountains and gardens, tomb shrines, palaces, or urban markets and religious complexes, and the simultaneous multiple perspectives to be found in certain later schools of miniature painting, which you can also see here, in the classic symbolic pan-Islamic repertoire of mystical lyric poetry, or in the intricately polished formulae of social etiquette, adab or ta'aruf, ritual, and social speech, specific to each local Muslim culture. In each of those cases, this characteristic rhythmic repetition is meant to evoke in the viewer or participant an inner harmony and symmetry, the transcendent inner balance that integrates the visible tensions and momentary attractions, both effective and intellectual, of each of its constituent parts. I'm in love with this phrase. I'm going to have to repeat it. How many aesthetics writers we have out here? It's really funny when you just pull this out of the air. What happens in this rhythm is it evokes an inner harmony and symmetry, something inside yourself, a transcendent inner balance that integrates the visible tensions and momentary attractions, both affective, emotional, and intellectual, of each of its constituent parts. This is what all the Islamic arts are striving after. Indeed, this recurrent contemplative process, and here I don't mean the visual arts, but everything else too. Indeed, this recurrent contemplative process is immediately manifest when we simply look at the kaleidoscopic harmony of any of the objects in this exhibit. No matter how small the piece, our physical eye alone cannot begin to grasp all the interwoven patterns, whether of geometry, color, calligraphy, or archetypal figurative elements, much less to hold on to them all at once. In fact, those patterns are meant to entice our eyes, drawing them from one intriguing area or structure or detail to another, like sight reading the separate notes or themes of a musical score, in a way that at first encounter can seem almost physically exhausting, so you're warned. Only gradually, often without even noticing it happen, does our mind, or rather some much deeper part of our spirit, begin to settle into a mysterious kind of unity and balance that is really only intimated by the intertwined forms of the visible ornament itself. And as with any effective work of music or poetry, those deeper forms and patterns we gradually discover are never quite the same. Their shapes and effects change, just as we do with each viewing. Now, all Islamic languages share a single multifaceted Quranic term for describing this mysterious inner process, which is the aesthetic aim and ideal of each of the Islamic arts. That word itself is dhikr, or it would be pronounced as zikr, like a lot of these words are pronounced but it means the active repetition of intimate prayer or remembrance and transforming recollection of God. Again, no theory is needed to discover the intriguing mystery and contemplative depths of this music any more than with the artifacts brought together in this exhibit. But a closer look at the central concept of dhikr could help us to appreciate its profound connections with the other Islamic arts and with the wider aesthetic and ethical world of their original creators and audiences. So let us turn to the fundamental spiritual role of the Islamic humanities as dhikr, as both cultural reminders and repeated individual invocations of the archetypal divine qualities of the most beautiful names, so as modelists now, within the broader Quranic vision of human being and the world. This next section is called Remembrance in the Quran and Islamic Aesthetics. So the Quran, in its origins in the daily ritual and prayer life of Muslims throughout the centuries, has always been primarily an oral, that's A-U-R-A-L, a living musical reality. The Arabic word Quran actually means recitation, and within the revelations themselves, that same term is also, and perhaps primarily, applied to the one divine archetype, the kitab, of all revelation and creation. Hence, the fundamental Quranic image for God's creative relation to the cosmos is that of speaking, or as we'll see in the musical piece at the end, of singing, of the divine word. So that creative divine music is directly reflected in the response of all the creatures, even if we human beings alone so often remain spiritually tone-deaf to that ongoing universal concert. I'll put quotes up here when I'm quoting the Quran. The seven heavens and the earth and all who are in them are singing his praises. There is no thing but that it is singing forth with his praise, and yet you do not grasp their song of praise. Within this metaphysical perspective, the ultimate purpose of the Quran is simply to help remind human beings of their own unique and central spiritual role within that cosmic psalmody. Indeed, the Quran itself is specifically termed the reminder to all the words, Dhikra, Bin-Alameen, more than 20 times in the course of the revelation. The forms of the Arabic root for dhikr express several equally essential aspects of that all-encompassing divine concert. It can mean a reminder, an act of remembering or recollecting, mentioning or repeating something, and hence the process of invoking in prayer, whether silently or in audible chanting or even rhythmic song and dance, the divine names, those archetypal attributes and qualities of God that are made manifest in creation and then realized and returned to their divine source for each of our individual human acts of recollection. According to the Quranic account, all human beings were originally aware of that constitutive relation with God in the spiritual world before they came to earth, through their common primordial root in the divine spirit. Remember God's blessing on you by which he bound you all, the primordial covenant, when you said, we hear and we joyfully obey, and be mindful of God. So all the realms of existence and experience alike are the constantly repeated divine signs and archetypal symbols, constituting God's creative act of remembrance. In the language of the Quran, we shall show them our signs on their horizons and in their souls, until it becomes clear to them that he, or who, the divine spirit essence, is the truly real. From the human point of view, of course, few could argue that the Quran's repeated observation that no one really remembers but the people of hearts. Yet in response to the more frequent human condition of spiritual deafness and relative heedlessness, the Quran constantly reminds us of our unique responsibility for dhikr, for remembering God and mentioning or evoking the divine names at every moment of life. Remember God while standing and sitting and lying on your sides, and remember your Lord in your soul, humbly and in awe in the morning and in the evening. And remember and mention your Lord whenever you have forgotten. Thus the imperative of dhikr, in this broadest sense of all awareness, all recollection and realization of the divine presence, extends far beyond the dozens of explicit Quranic citations. Ultimately, it includes every facet of the practical spiritual role of the Quran, the earlier divine revelations, and the plural of all those divine messengers, teachers, and spiritual guides, who throughout the ages are the spiritually living embodiments, actually you can't really say the living presences of this divine reminder, not necessarily earthly embodiments. The very essence of this inner movement of remembrance is the soul's inner returning from the visible forms of this world to their underlying realities, the divine attributes or names, in the unseen world, or the next life of the spirit, life or al-akhirah. That transforming movement of spiritual recollection, which every viewer of this exhibit must experience from time to time, is most powerfully represented in the nearly intangible states and rhythms characteristic of the traditional musical or chanted forms of dhikr, which often involve sacred dance as well. But while that concept helps explain the deeper inner aesthetic connections between the traditional Islamic arts, it also illuminates their deeper ties to all the formative religious and ritual role of the Quran throughout Islamic life in the past helped to mold the wider civilizational canons and ideals of aesthetic expression and appreciation in at least the following ways. First, as we already mentioned, at the most fundamental formal and structural level, each of the Islamic arts, whether musical, visual, or literary, has typically come to reflect the Quran's distinctive musical qualities of multifaceted rhythm and the constantly interwoven symphonic repetition and subtle elaboration of its central themes. Although the classical Islamic literatures are still not so readily accessible in our culture or language, the translations of the Arabian Nights provide another representative illustration of this aesthetic principle translated into narrative form. Second, the visual iconography of Islamic art, the selection of basic themes and formal elements chosen to be represented or focused on in the visual arts from the very earliest period, has continued to be drawn from the central visible images of the divine presence that are highlighted throughout the Quran itself. In the Quran, these recurrent images and symbolic reminders of the transcendent reality revealed through all the appearances of the creation of all the world fall into four basic groups. The most obvious, and this overlaps a little bit between what is both in the catalog and shown in the show here. The most obvious of these families of symbols is, of course, the Arabic calligraphy of the divine words themselves, which in itself developed into one of the most respected visual arts and spiritual disciplines in many Islamic cultures. That's why you find so many pen boxes, for example, floating around in this and other exhibits. Equally evident, and again, something that has its correlate in Eastern religions and civilization as well. Equally evident in the visual arts and in architecture, as well as in the basic symbolism of all Islamic mystical and lyric poetry, is the second distinct family of Quranic visual images, the paradisiacal symbols of the life-giving spirit in the spiritual world, which include gardens, fountains, and flowing streams of many hues, the celestial divine banquet with its spiritual wines, wine-bearers, companions, musicians, birds, greenery, and fruits of every sort. Where artistic allusions to such spiritual realities, whether in poetry, architecture, or the visual arts, are conscious and intentional, the complex aesthetic of colors also subtly reflects the influence of these paradigmatic Quranic symbols. For example, an earlier reference to the colors of the four elements, the green water of life, and so on. The third major family of Quranic visual symbols are all the complex cosmological references to the mysterious divine cosmological ordering of the heavens, the theophanies of light and shadow, the spiritual realities of planets and stars and celestial angels, and the four sublunar elements, hence to all the infinite geometric and mathematical patterns underlying the harmonious transformations and recombinations within each of those cosmological domains. And since each Arabic letter and word, just as with Hebrew, is also a specific number, there is a far-reaching inherent symbolic resonance between the Quranic calligraphy, or any Arabic expression, and all these geometric cosmological patterns of creation and revelation that are unfortunately lost in most modern viewers. Here in particular, all the classic elements of Islamic religious architecture and its ornamentation offer some of the most striking aesthetic reminders of those all-encompassing cosmic patterns of the divine artist. And finally, of course, there are those archetypal figurative actors, from angels and jinn to the whole divine human comedy, whose stories fill the scriptures and tradition alongside the heroic correlates drawn from each local Muslim culture's myth and legend. This will be the subject of our old colleague Jack Bernard's lecture on October 17th at 7 p.m., I believe, here. So keep that date in mind as well. Heroes, legends, and saints. The third guiding aesthetic assumption reflecting the Quranic model in each Islamic art is the essentially contemplative aim of each of these artistic forms, most overtly symbolized by the central scriptural role of fragrances, perfumes, blossoms, fruits, and breezes, all classic theophanic images of the divine breath and spirit. The word spirit is what is intangible, which has all sorts of effects, but we can't see it, hence these other images which all allude to the spirit. The essential purpose here is always what is discovered inside each viewer or auditor, the mysterious theophanic, that means God revealing, shift in awareness from the material temporal forms in this world to their divine source and reality in the other world, the higher world. In other words, a persistent seeing through the palpable form to the divine beauty that lies beyond. In a word, you can say Islamic culture is an théologie de transparence, but it doesn't translate into English because you lose that sense of appearing through something that you have in transparent in French. So, in this respect, the endlessly varied musical forms of dhikr, whether simply chanted, sung, or with their more elaborate musical accompaniment, most directly illustrate and embody that characteristic recreation of Quranic intentions that takes more palpable form in the other Islamic visual and architectural arts, and eventually all the Islamic humanities. A final formative principle of traditional Islamic aesthetics, again based on the Quranic ideal, is the assumption of the actively transformational and participatory nature of the spiritual relationship connecting the creator or performer and their audiences. An art designed to transport us instantly from this world to the next, from spiritual heedlessness to a heightened awareness of the divine presence and names directly within all our experience, is not likely to work in a passive or undemanding fashion. Such a radically spiritual and participatory guiding aesthetic conception obliges us to enter into a very different universe from those perspectives that view, as we often see today, viewing the artist's works as simply another kind of production or distracting entertainment. Hence, appreciating any of the classical forms of the Islamic arts requires us to cross many of the supposed boundaries between what our contemporary culture now tends to view as somehow separate realms of religious, aesthetic, ethical, economic, and intellectual activity and experience. For the most part, we are no longer used to thinking of, much less actually living, embroidery, gardening, conversation, or doing the chores as integral acts of prayer and remembrance. One striking indicator of this very different understanding of the spiritual role of artists and aesthetic values in traditional Islamic cultures is that the closest expression we can find for the fine arts, the word I missed, in most Islamic languages is adabiyat, from the word adab. Sorry, very important word. Adab, which means something like the spiritually and ethically appropriate intention and its harmonious expression in right action within each particular situation. The spiritually and ethically appropriate intention and its harmonious expression in right action within each particular situation. From this perspective, so as adab is ihsan in our social and ethical life. From this perspective, artistic creation and appreciation necessarily requires sometimes unsettling kind of inner surrender before we can discover the underlying peace of that divine harmony to which earthly beauty naturally leads us. It is no accident that these two inseparable aspects of this direct inner experience of the artist's transforming intention, contemplative surrender and the resulting spiritual peace, are the original literal meaning of the Arabic word Islam. The mysteries of Islam. Last part of theology. We're almost back to 3. Yet another fundamental feature of the traditional Islamic arts and humanities, implicit in each of the points I've just mentioned, was the typical anonymity of their creators and the persuasiveness of these distinctive cultural forms precisely among the most popular and uneducated elements of society. One striking indication of the deeper metaphysical truth of the Quranic perspective is the way that the actual concrete realization of these essential spiritual virtues, whether it be in the arts or in ethics or any other sphere of human life, often seems to have had remarkably little to do with formal Arabic learning and related so-called religious disciplines. As we have already mentioned, the Islamic tradition has a singularly expressive term, ihsan, for describing this unique God-given capacity for actually perceiving and then bringing into existence what is beautiful and at the same time truly good. This single word conveys the essential inner unity of that accomplished living awareness of the divine presence, whatever its momentary domain of expression. In the Quran, that highest spiritual virtue is connected above all to God's special love for the prophets and the most accomplished friends of God. Jesus and Abraham, for example, are archetypal Muslimun. And the famous prophetic hadith of Gabriel that is still widely used as a sort of catechism in many parts of the Muslim world today, the prophet describes the true nature of ihsan in terms that clearly suggest the most characteristic principles of Islamic art, as the harmonious spiritual marriage of aesthetic, ethical, and intellectual perceptions demands within their unifying spiritual source and aim. That famous hadith itself recounts the messenger's replies to 3 peremptory questions boldly posed to him by a mysterious white-robed stranger, whom he later, much later, identifies for his bewildered countenance as the angel Gabriel who came to teach the people their religion. People were pretty respectful of the prophet, so here's this white-robed stranger just walks up on the markets and day and plops himself down and says, "Tell me, what is Iman?" Okay, so Islam, and finally, ihsan. So, and at the end, the prophet explains that what Gabriel had come to teach people their religion, that is deen, the primordial relationship between each soul and its creator. Nothing more clearly highlights the culminating and guiding role of aesthetic perception in creation and the essentially spiritual understanding of the artist-creator's aim and activity within this tradition. The The stranger's first two questions are about the intellectual premises and ritual dimensions of religion, which the prophet answers by summarizing the universal objects of faith and our essential practical religious obligations of true monotheism, prayer, charity, and self-restraint, or fasting. Then Gabriel asks, what is ihsan? What is this word we've been talking about tonight? Literally, what is the perception and realization of what is truly beautiful and good? Muhammad's far-reaching reply, describing this ultimate human purpose of all religion, is usually translated as, and I'll slow down here, to serve God as though you see him. It's to serve and to worship, as though you see him. The old Hebrew root as well. For even if you did not see him, surely he sees you. Again, ihsan is defined there as to serve God as though you see him, or even if you did not see him, surely he sees you. But the last part of his famous reply can also be translated in the Arabic. It's very typical of Arabic and all these Islamic languages. It can also be translated and understood even more revealing. And if you are not, then you do see him. And if you are not, then you do see him, and he sees you. Truly Islamic art, from this perspective, has fully accomplished its purpose precisely when the ego of its viewer, or its listener, or its reader, disappears in the actual presence, in the full contemplation of that divine beauty. Or in liturgical terms, perhaps more resonant here, the ultimate aim of that art, as a reminder, is realized transubstantiation. Art 3, mourning and rebirth. Now, could external circumstances alone ever put an end to that contemplation of the divine beauty and to its inevitably transforming consequences? Coming back to earth here. That question quickly brings us back to those related experiences I had asked you to think of at the beginning of this talk, and to the closely related question of why this exhibit so suddenly and abruptly stops as we approach the end of the 19th century. Or why should it end at all? Certainly the world has continued to witness equally gifted and accomplished Muslim artists and creators throughout the century and a half since the last objects we will discover here. But it is also true that those more recent artists, whatever their own aims and intentions, have unavoidably found themselves working and creating within a radically different, increasingly global world order, as the millennial Islamic civilization, so memorably illuminated here, was everywhere attacked, undermined, and shattered, whether gradually or overnight. Civilizations, history would suggest, are very hard to kill, and so they rarely die a natural death. Throughout the pre-modern agrarian era, we usually find that history's many succeeding waves of invasion, enslavement, subjugation, even the massive genocides and turmoil of the Mongol era cannot kill a spiritual ideal. Almost without exception, the intrinsic human inspiration and beauty of that civilizational ideal, such as we have just described, has ended up rapidly converting, transforming, indeed ultimately civilizing each new barbarian invader or tyrant. Same thing happened to the Mongols in the Islamic world that happened in the world of China. One generation, they were converted by this, what you'll see in this exhibit. Okay. But even in our own time, despite previously unimaginable powers and deeds of destruction, of neuronic shock and awe, several of these pre-industrial civilizations have still managed to live on in the surviving seeds of scattered extraordinary individuals, living exemplars of ihsan and essential adab, who remain indelibly etched in our memory and imagination, just like the unforgettable living books at the end of Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. The first years of my university life still seem enchanted by the memory of transforming encounters with such rare individuals, refugee survivors of European civilization's last century of devastating ideological wars, only to discover, as I later went abroad to live and study in their old homelands, just how irremediably disappeared were those once vibrant cultural words in which those individuals themselves had continued to evolve and teach while living here in America in exile. But what of that Islamic civilization, which is our focus here? There's no need tonight to enter into the centuries-long catalog of colonization, invasions, wars, betrayals, enslavement, and mass impoverishment that have so recently, in purely historical terms, ravished virtually every corner of the Islamic world. A chronicle only too familiar to modern historians, and so often and just as brutally repeated in many other regions of what we so innocently term Third World. Nor is there any need to underline the obvious import and repercussions of such visible and repeated public historical events. Yet in reality, the shock of the sudden destruction of one's whole aesthetic, spiritual, and ethical order is often far more subtle and therefore unsuspected at the time. Just as in our own moral lives, the process of civilizational and spiritual destruction tends to end not with a bang, but a whimper. Or rather, the audible and visible bang we now see on television comes much, much later. Here are three brief and telling anecdotes from my own youthful voyages of discovery that immediately came to mind when Jonathan Sheila asked me to deliver this lecture. When I was at first living with a traditional family in the old city of Meknes in Morocco, very early in my Arabic studies, one day I found my host about to burn as firewood several intricately carved wooden panels and chests, part of wooden suitcases originally, each of them representing weeks or months of work for a single local craftsman, which were certainly in their own way as aesthetically powerful and impressive as some of the objects you'll find in this exhibition. About the same time, we started to find in the amazingly beautiful old pewter ewers and pitchers, whose use is in that culture, some people will know, equally remarkable products of local workmanship, being left out in the trash all over the city. It's like you walked in here and this exhibit was out on the garbage heap. The occasion for this puzzling public sacrifice, as we soon learned in response to our mystified and somewhat outraged protests, was the local arrival of plastic. Of products in plastic equally or even more practically functional, but costing only a small fraction of those traditional local productions. Within a few years of similar ongoing substitutions, the centuries-old socioeconomic structure of the local workplaces and bazaars, the living heart of all that cities and most Moroccan cities' millennial religious and devotional shrines, devotional life shrines, Sufi orders, singing groups, saints' festivals, and all the rest, had been reduced to a relatively impoverished adjunct to the global mass tourist industry. When I arrived a few years later in the great city of saints of Herat in western Afghanistan, just before the apocalyptic impact, truly apocalyptic impact of the Soviet invasion, I found the amazing combination of a great city, the second largest in the country at that time, without any electricity or motor vehicles whatsoever. Hippies would pass through, trucks would pass through, but people there didn't have their own. Living in a state of truly unimaginably peaceful silence, interrupted only by the natural sound of the wind, animal bells and all the horses, and above all, the endlessly diverse musical instruments and singing by men and women of all ages that seemed to occupy virtually everyone we encountered, from carriage drivers to craftsmen, merchants, even the beggars. The only time in my life I've ever experienced a remotely comparable deep state of natural contemplation and silence anywhere outside remote wilderness areas or contemplative retreats was in Boston during the Great Blizzard of 1978. Were you around? But when I eagerly returned to Herat at the next year's Nowruz holiday, a few local workmen had also already proudly returned from the Gulf with their boomboxes and tape cassettes of Indian movie music, eagerly played for curious crowds on every street corner. Almost overnight, in a cultural revolution spiritually as devastating as the ensuing Soviet invasions, that unimaginably diverse local culture of universal music and song and meditation, so deeply rooted in the accumulated spiritual experience and yearnings of each individual, family, and tribe, was replaced by the latest fashions in pop music, whether it's South Asia or globally. And we all know now, much more intimately, of course, the similarly virulent effectiveness and far more visibly destructive impact of the next state of ideological pseudo-religious importations that soon followed that same path from the Wahhabi Gulf. When a musicologist friend first took me off to the mountains and mystics of Kurdistan and the deserts of Khorasan, I was immediately enthralled with the enchanting secret panorama of spiritual music, ecstatic rituals, dhikr, and the unforgettable saintly figures I encountered everywhere in those remote locations, so amazingly mirroring, too, the lost world I had always imagined of my own Indian Cherokee ancestors. Today, less than 3 decades later, that once esoteric, initiatic world of ecstatic music and rituals, just like the Allahis, dhikrs, and other sessions of similar groups into which I had been so warmly welcomed in Morocco, Anatolia, and Afghanistan, can now be found openly displayed in the world music shelves of music stores anywhere in the West, while some of its best performers now fill the largest concert halls in London, Paris, and New York. Such phenomena, equally applicable to certain other Islamic humanities, are a more hopeful reminder that despite the sudden disappearance of their close-knit spiritual communities and local cultures of origin, such widespread destruction also scatters the seeds of a potentially wider, even global rebirth. Now, my purpose here in mentioning this last handful of stories is not as an occasion for nostalgic lament, although I fall into that from time to time, nor for utopian fancies or an imagined return to those lost communities, much less the sorts of apocalyptic revenge that still entrances some. Though I must add that very little that you will encounter in the daily news from that quarter of the world will make much sense unless we take several centuries' accumulation of such painful life lessons to heart. Instead, I hope that you can now simply connect these brief historical illustrations, with those personal, smaller-scale memories of your own telling childhood experiences of frustrated and abortive Islam, of each time we were forced to set aside and abandon our own innate striving for artistic, ethical, and spiritual perfection that I asked you to recall at the very beginning of this talk. For such memorable experiences are poignant reminders, and the most real reminders, hopefully more practically effective ones than those more explosive reminders that fill each evening's news, of the perennial challenge that is perfectly summed up in the famous hadith of our title. That divine beauty, like the divine creative love, Rahman, which brings this entire cosmos into being at every instant, cries out for the appropriate human response, the challenge to first discover and then to realize and actualize our inner perfection of spiritual vision in all the corresponding beauties of right and beautiful action of Adab and Islam. As this exhibition should remind us quite palpably, civilization comes into being one soul at a time. Civilization comes into being one soul at a time. For the aesthetic marvels we admire here always begin with necessarily individual acts of inspiration, intervention, and intelligent reflection, and only such inspired creative acts can bring about a wider spiritual and ethical communion, a truly human cosmos of realized order and beauty, adequately reflecting that divine cosmophilia so richly evoked in the famous hadith that provides the title of this talk. He is beautiful, and he loves beauty. So from that perspective, this exhibition is indeed a powerful inspiration and necessary reminder of fundamental spiritual and eventually ethical, social, and political possibilities of rebirth and reconstruction, which depend in the end not on any particular outward circumstances, but simply on the conscience, intention, and integrity of each human being who sets out on that same shared path of Ihsan, of worshiping God as though we see Him. The perennial challenge of that divine love of the cosmos and of our own necessary human response of love is rigorously summarized in these well-chosen words from a long-ago Spanish visionary, Ibn Arabi, who looked forward to a time, the Kairos, such as this. I'll go slow on this one. And then this is the knowledge that what God made manifest to our vision in the bodies of all the world is an adornment for these bodies. What he's really saying there is that we create what's ugly. We create what's evil. And the second knowledge, he says, in this too, is the knowledge of which eye it is that a person sees with when they see the whole world as beautiful, when they do see it, so that they respond to it spontaneously with beautiful actions. He's really paraphrasing the hadith of Ihsan here. Which eye is it that a person sees with when they see the whole world as beautiful, when they do see it? Because we only really see the world when we see it as beautiful, so that they respond to it spontaneously with beautiful actions. Lyrical poetry, that's philosophy. Lyrical poetry is more memorable and evocative, and everything I've mentioned this evening is already intimated in the following two opening lines of a lyric ghazal by the great master Hafiz of Shiraz, sung here by a singular Iranian artist, Parisa, one of those beautiful companions, whose vocal ornament is certainly the appropriate musical equivalent of all of these visual icons brought together in this stunning exhibition. These words don't do justice to what you'll hear sung, but in English is, the musician of love has a wondrous instrument in song. The impression of each chord she strikes and each veil she raises. The Persian means both things at the same time. In fact, it means that each fret you strike when you're strumming an instrument. So we're talking about the suffering that we experience in life that God brings to us to lead us to sing. The impression of each chord she strikes, each veil she raises, has its way to a place. One line. May the cosmos never be without the lament of lovers, such a beautifully harmonious and joyous